All right. So I want to talk with you now about starting to look at food safety crises and mostly foodborne illness outbreak crisis through what is considered a strategic communication lens. And I'll kind of talk to you a little bit about what that means here at the beginning. But I do want to let you know that, like almost everything we're going to talk about today, this is a very complex and complicated discipline and process. And so this is a broad overview, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the foundational ideas and concepts that are important to just have an awareness of, and then walk through some cases that we've already seen and talked about today, which I'm thrilled about, because what that means is we're on the right track in terms of crises and cases that have both significant economic impact, and then also impact on the organizations and the industries that are involved. So Professor Poloshka and I sort of developing our presentations as we talked, we saw some commonalities, and I'm excited to see and hear about those today. So another quick thing I want to mention to you is that when I am talking today, there is a fundamental presumption that I am making, and that is that organizations and individuals should come to their work as what we call, quote unquote, good actors, right? The presumption that people are not out to harm others, or the presumption that people are being honest brokers of information and things like that. So we will talk about a couple of instances where that is not the case, but understand that that is the fundamental piece here that is sort of important to the direction or the perspective that we're coming to this from. Okay, so first things first, and I do this with my classes as I use a term that it can mean many different things. And so what is a crisis? Well, several different definitions from several different researchers and experts. But one of the definitions is this idea of a perceived violation of stakeholder expectations. So something goes wrong, a group has an expectation, and that expectation is violated. And that has some negative outcome for either the stakeholders themselves and or the organization. And as I use the term organization, what I mean by that is could be any type of organization, could be a government agency, could be a government department such as the USDA, could be the CDC, could be a private company that is interested in and that makes a profit, could also be a nonprofit organization. So I use the term organization as an umbrella. And really, it doesn't have anything, it encompasses people who are working for an agency, people, organizations that are for profit, nonprofit, those types of things, covers all of those things. Another definition, organizational crisis is a specific, unexpected, and non-routine event. So I like this definition a little bit more because it uses these three terms, right? So it talks about a specific thing happening. It talks about something being unexpected, non-routine. So it's not something that happens over and over at this time every year. Okay. One of the examples that I always like to think of when I'm talking about non-routine is when I worked in the beef industry in public relations for several years, and each May we would start doing communication about food safety, because we knew this was a time that people would start going out and having picnics, and they would leave their egg salad with mayonnaise out in the sun, and then also they would grill hamburgers or things like that. So we would incorporate and talk about food safety and how to practice food safety or safe food handling. That each year that was a routine thing that we knew that was going to happen. And so crisis is specifically non-routine. Another component of this definition, the incident has high levels of uncertainty, So there's a lot that we don't know. This may sound familiar to you in terms of living through the COVID-19 pandemic. Uncertainty is paramount. Right now, there's so much that we don't know. And then also presents an organization with both opportunities and threats. And what we mean here by high priority goals is really, what's the goal? Is the goal of the organization to sell a product? Is the goal of the organization to help out members of an industry? Whatever those goals are, this crisis situation both provides opportunities to improve, but also threats to whatever the goal of the organization is. And so a third definition here, just to show you the array of definitions, a crisis is a major occurrence with a potential negative outcome affecting the organization. This definition broadens it to the industry as well. And then also the publics, the products, the services, or good name. And here's where we get to the part where we start talking about, this is really fundamentally part of an organization's reputation, right? An organization's good name. And so this is where I start sharing with you a little bit, just a peek into public relations. And crisis communication is seen is really part or under the umbrella of strategic communication. And strategic communication really means public relations. There's all of these synonyms and all of these terms, but broadly, strategic communication is really a process that's focused on building relationships that are mutually beneficial to an organization of any kind and its stakeholders, their publics, their audiences, those groups and individuals that they work with. That have anything to do with the company. I'll give you some definition of stakeholders later. But essentially, it's anybody who has any kind of stake or interest in the organization. And so public relations itself is really about engaging and building relationships, making sure that as we do that, we're helping people see that we are a good organization, that we are positive, and that we are doing the right things. So again, you see that presumption, right, of being a good actor is really fundamental here. So the idea of crisis communication is actually the dialogue between the organization and any individuals or groups of stakeholders before, during, and after the crisis, okay? So a fundamental piece of crisis communication is that it's not just as things are happening, it includes the before and it includes the after. And then another important thing to know, and this is something I see and hear a lot as I work in this area, that people talk about crisis management. Oh, you're teaching a crisis management class. Well, no, I'm specifically interested in the communication, but it is very closely aligned with crisis management. And so a lot of the literature, we could be looking at this through a management, an organizational management lens, but we're looking at this through a communication lens. And so one thing to be aware of is that effective crisis communication, and I will say this several times, really can lessen the impact of negative effects of a crisis on an organization and potentially avoid that crisis altogether. Unfortunately, we don't hear a lot about those crises that are avoided altogether because they don't make it into the news. So those are harder to see. What we'll talk about today are lots of not great examples, lots of crises that maybe weren't handled very well, but that have aspects that can really teach us a lot, and that maybe even something turned out okay in the end for either the organization or their stakeholders. So I just want to share with you 3 leading resources that I use in teaching and that I have found very helpful, and the researchers that have written them. So these 3 books are really different perspectives on how to handle crisis communication. I'm using this first one on the left in my course this year. I've used the other 2 in previous years and previous courses. And really, this is one of the things about crisis communication that is unfortunate in the sense that we'd love to have a plan that is ready and made for us. But the reality is that we really do need to go through the information and glean what works for our organization. So what I'm talking with you about today is very, very broad. And I am going to give you some specific action steps later on in my next presentation. And those action steps are very, very broad. They're going to need to be taken and tailored and specified to a specific organization in order for them to be of any use. But I think these are very fundamental ideas and concepts that contribute to what we know about food safety and foodborne illness crises and how we can get better as a result of learning and studying the past. So you've seen this image before. These are notable food safety related cases that are primarily, and I use the word primarily because you'll see some on here that are not, that are primarily food safety, foodborne illness outbreak related. The one that is really not is 2003's bovine spongiform encephalopathy. So I'm not really going to talk about that, but I will tell you that the reason it's included here is because, and Dr. Poloshka referenced it, this is what the press called mad cow disease. And this is really, really important because although it was not a risk here in the United States, it was a perceived risk. And it is not necessarily considered a foodborne illness. It is fundamental to public opinion and how people perceive food safety related problems. So it's included here because it really does make a difference. But it is not specifically, as far as I'm aware, it's not considered a foodborne illness issue. Couple of the others, and I will talk about most of these, but the multiple notable E. coli outbreaks in beef. Gosh, you know, that was about the time that I started working in the beef industry, and it seemed month over month and year over year from about 2000 to about 2010 that we had repeated issues with E. coli in beef. In fact, I remember in 2006 when E. coli in bagged spinach in California was an issue, thinking to myself as I worked for a national trade association in the beef industry, thank heavens this time it's not us. And so I put that there because there are many notable ones that are worthy, but just given our time today, I wanted to just share, you know, acknowledge them and then sort of walk away and make sure that we talk about some of the other ones. So I'm going to start out telling you a few, these are misconceptions. This is a list of misconceptions of crisis communication. And this is from one of those reference sources that I showed you earlier. And I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I do think it's interesting that there are a few that are, first of all, it's an interesting list. Second of all, there are a few that I think are really important. The misconception that crises do not have any positive value. This is precisely the reason that I am interested in studying crisis communication and crisis situations, because I believe that there is positive value. Out of all of the grief and horribleness, we do learn things about how to make things better for the future, how to improve policies, how to improve practices. There are some significant innovations that I'll mention to you here in just a few minutes in some different cases. So there is a lot of positive value that can come out of crises. It is also, you know, studying crisis communication or working in crisis communication, you really need to make sure that you understand that it is not about who's responsible and it's not about blame. Instead, it's really about making sure that the organization and the folks involved really do whatever, you know, go to all the possible extents to make this situation right. So it's about more than the organization. It's about making things right, doing the right thing. Another example here, or another misconception, doing crisis communication well involves taking a rigid and defensive stance. If you look at any examples today or beyond, you'll see that a rigid defensive stance is absolutely 180 degrees wrong. You want to make sure that you are responsive, flexible, open, communicative, you know, transparent, those types of things. It's also not about making sure that you have this elaborate, prefabricated or pre-put together crisis plan and you're going to follow it step by step. And then lastly, the one that I want to call out is that this misconception that crisis comm is really about managing the image or the reputation of an organization. Again, the organization often thinks that this is the case. However, it's not just about that. It's about focusing on a solution and decreasing or lessening the impact of the crisis on those affected. And a lot of times those affected are outside of the organization. So lots of misconceptions, a few important ones to point out to you today. So my first, what I sort of consider to be the beginning of the modern food safety crisis era is the incident with E. coli outbreak at Jack in the Box in the Pacific Northwest in 1993. This is not the first incidence of E. coli 0157H7 in undercooked beef. However, because of its size and because of the number of people and the number of states affected, and because of how it was responded to both by the organization Jack in the Box and the government, this is a notable case, and it really does sort of mark the beginning of this era of, at least from my perspective, crisis communication and food safety related crisis communication. So you can see here it was a pretty wide, at least for 1993. I don't know if you remember 1993, if you were around then, but I actually am originally from California, and so I do remember this outbreak situation. And I remember as I talk through crisis communication with students, we all have the story of the crisis that we viscerally remember and our almost our physical reactions to, oh my gosh, I don't want to get sick. And so this is the first time where we had a high number of people and we actually had deaths of 4 children. That, you know, regardless of what we think about whether this is the way it should be or not, the death of people who have compromised immune systems is seen as heightening the crisis, right? I mean, we speak, and I don't think this is wrong personally, when we hear of the death of a child, right, we are oftentimes more affected, more negatively affected. And so the fact that 4 children died was really significant at this point. Almost 200 people left with some sort of permanent injury, and Dr. Poloshka mentioned to you several of the effects of foodborne illness outbreaks. The interesting part as a crisis communications expert here is in how this outbreak was caused. And what happened was the Jack in the Box company actually was found to have not operated its cooking grills at an appropriate temperature. A little bit of a backtrack here. The way this came about was that a public health doctor, an epidemiologist in the Washington State Public Health Authority, saw a cluster of illnesses of E. coli among children. And so he raised the alarm. Things were traced back to Jack in the Box. Well, Jack in the Box was having what was called the Monster Burger promotion. And this was a special promotion. It was on discount, that kind of thing. So demand for this burger was really, really high. In fact, some of the restaurants really couldn't keep up with demand. And so because of that, there is some thinking that because of that chaos and that impact, that this problem related to making sure that the grills that they were using were at the appropriate temperature was sort of lost in the shuffle. Another important thing to know about this particular incident is prior to this problem, Jack in the Box had actually been sent, at least in Washington State, a notification from the Washington State authorities that the state was raising their standards, raising the temperature that grills needed to operate at. And so the Washington State requirements were higher than the national requirements. And so the state sent Jack in the Box a letter. Well, Jack in the Box made the mistake, first of all, when they were talking about the crisis, when they were sort of doing the communication through the crisis as it was happening, said that they didn't get that letter, which indeed they had gotten that letter. So there's one sort of crux of problem there, right, in terms of communication. The state sends you a notification that you need to change something that has a potential impact on food safety, a potential impact on your customers, and that isn't disseminated widely. Huge potential crisis, right? So in terms of crisis communication, the company supposedly didn't know, but they had been notified, right? That they needed to follow these higher state cooking levels. Well, that's one challenge, except that when the investigation was done, it was found that they weren't even meeting the levels of temperature for their grills that were the national standards. So it was sort of a moot point. They also, in terms of when this, as the crisis was unfolding, they really tried to pass on the blame for the existence of E. coli to the meat supplier, which didn't turn out well for them. It wasn't a particularly difficult, it didn't make things more difficult for them, but it started this conversation that Dr. Poloshka referenced. Who is responsible, right, for food safety? And so the company began to realize, and they didn't have a crisis communication plan. I don't think they had a crisis management plan. So again, this is sort of the beginning of this era of recognizing this is something that is necessary. So what the company did was they recalled and they destroyed more than 28,000 pounds of hamburger. They said that this was an extraordinary response. They wanted to show that they were going above and beyond. One of the things that I think is really a great outcome, and this is all over the crisis communication literature, is that two kinds of changes happened as a result of this crisis. The first one is that Jack in the Box designed a whole internal communication system, or redesigned their whole internal procedures, so that this idea of, oh, we didn't get that letter, never happened again. And so they took some specific steps for those specific procedures. But another thing really interesting, at least to me, happened was beyond the company, the government started taking action and the industry started taking action. So things like these things happened. So E. coli 0157H7 was then classified as a reportable disease and an adulterant in food, which means that's something that you can't have in food, and so you have to test for it. The FDA increased the recommended internal cook temperatures for burgers and made sure that that was a nationwide requirement. FSIS, Food Safety Inspection Service, introduced safe food handling labels on raw meat and poultry, and they put together an educational campaign that went along with that. FSIS introduced testing for E. coli in ground beef that had to happen at a packing plant where that ground beef was ground. And then the USDA introduced a specific pathogen reduction program, and this is where we get HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points. And this is what triggered the creation of HACCP for the meat industry. So you see why I'm saying this is sort of the beginning of the modern era, right? Additionally, the Trade Association for the beef industry nationally organized a task force to start funding scientific and academic research in this area to address the problem. So it is really a big marker of the Jack in the Box crisis. Another critical early crisis related to E. coli is Odwalla's 1996 crisis. And this is significant because it's not in the beef industry. Also to me, significant because it's founded in Northern California, fairly near to where I am from. And again, I remember this crisis. So Odwalla, if you're not familiar with the brand today, it was established and distinguished as a very health conscious brand. It was something that was used to promote healthy lifestyles, to say that our product is natural and beneficial and safe. They chose because they believed that there was a negative effect on taste and potentially even the health of the product, of their juices. They believed that using pasteurization actually was a negative thing. So they didn't use pasteurization. They had another process that was related to an acid wash, and that was believed to be an industry acceptable alternative to pasteurization. And it was effective, supposedly, in preventing bacterial contamination. Well, what happened was, and again, this is in the Pacific Northwest, this is actually also in Seattle, which is where the Jack in the Box crisis started. E. coli was found in their apple juice, and it was immediately prior to Halloween. It was 1 or 2 days. And the challenge here was for the company that, oh my gosh, this is a time of the year where people tend to drink apple juice, warm cider, hot apple cider, those types of things. So the company said immediately, we're going to recall our product. They did it at the cost of $6.5 million to themselves. they immediately expressed sympathy and regret and said, we are going to be an industry leader in this area. We want to make sure that our beverage that is healthy is safe. One of the things that I didn't include on here is that the company actually did a very, very, I believe, smart thing. And they hired a public relations agency to help them manage the crisis. So not only how to communicate about it, but made recommendations about how do you handle notifying people? What do you do with the product? Well, that's why they recalled the product. So there's two really sort of monumental, at least from the perspective that I study, two monumental things that this outbreak had going for it. One was the company is really noted as the first organization to use a website. So yeah, you have to think back to 1996. Websites were not as ubiquitous as they are now. They used a website to communicate not only with their internal stakeholders, but also their external stakeholders. Anybody who cared or wanted information about Odwalla and the crisis, they used a website to respond. So that was sort of a pivotal communication approach. And then the second piece that is really, again, makes this such a notable crisis is that the company, in terms of wanting to be an industry leader, they stuck to their guns and said, we don't want to use pasteurization. We understand now that this other process that we've been using doesn't work. We are going to find a new technology. And so what they did was they developed the process of flash pasteurization. I have to slow down when I say that because it sounds funny and I stumble over it a little bit. But they developed this, they innovated a new technology as a result of this crisis. Again, however, there was a real sort of glitch in the plan, or there was a real downside. In addition to people getting sick, there was a real downside for Odwalla as an organization here. They weren't actually aware, or they should have been based on data and information that was available to them. They were aware, they had a warning sign that they had a safety issue. And that was the fact that they tried to get their products at US Army commissaries on bases, right? And the US Army looked at their processes and said, no, the product isn't safe enough. Well, when it came time to do all the lawsuits and the investigation, this information came out. And so Odwalla, while it is an industry success story because it still exists, they have this mark against them in that they didn't communicate internally. They didn't examine the data, they didn't examine the problems, and that caused this crisis. So we see that even with companies doing the right thing, there's this underlying information that upon investigation, you can see they didn't do the right thing to start with. I'm not going to talk too much about E. coli and bagged spinach because this is something that we know fairly well. But one of the reasons it's significant, aside from in my own mind, working in the beef industry and thinking, it's not beef. It's not the first incident, but it is one of the most prominent. And it is one of the first instances, if not the first instance, where the CDC issued a broad warning about a commodity. Yes, they were eventually able to tie it to brand labels and things like that, and even pinpoint where the product came from. They were never able to definitively determine what caused this. So that is sort of a terrible thing, I would say. The outbreak covered 26 states and more than 200 people were sickened. So you again see the size of the impact as a major problem. They did think that it was the incident was tied back to a water source, but again, it was not definitive. And this is where the conversation about how do we ensure that producers are using good agricultural practices? This is something that we talk about in the industry, but where is the regulation? Where is the confirmation that this is indeed happening? And here we get to one of the major exceptions to the presumption of good faith, right? Or honest brokers or honest actors. The 2008-2009 salmonella in peanut paste involving the Peanut Company of America, Peanut Corporation of America. They were a company that was located in the Southeast United States, primarily in Georgia, but other states as well. And what happened here, if you're not familiar with this outbreak, was that because the company produced peanut paste, not peanut butter necessarily that goes into a jar, but peanut paste that then gets used in, as you can see here, cookies, cakes, pies, candies, cereals, crackers, donuts, and it goes on and on. This was an ingredient that was contaminated. So the size of this outbreak really, again, just sort of got bigger, right? Starting 2 years later than a significant outbreak in another product. We see, although it's not the same bacteria, not the same pathogen, not the same exact problem, but we do see a sort of an upping of the impact. One of the most important things to know about this incident was that the company was found on investigation to be doing the testing, supposedly, that they were supposed to do in terms of making sure there were no bacteria in the product. But they were testing and they were not holding. They were testing and they were shipping out product. And those products, some of them ended up being contaminated. And so this idea of shipping tainted product is what really horrifies me and others about this case because, and there is documentation, if you ever look into this case, you can see the emails from Stuart Parnell, who's the gentleman with his head in his hands up here in the upper right, or upper left, excuse me. He is on record. There are documents showing that he said, it doesn't matter, get it out, it's product, it's time and money and all of those kinds of things. And so that combined, so the bad actor, right, the bad acting or the malintent combined with 12 plus states, combined with the fact that this was an ingredient that was contaminated, was incredibly significant in terms of not only communicating about crisis, but in terms of food safety crisis situations, just sort of getting epic here. This really concerned consumers. There was a lot of confusion about, we don't necessarily think about the peanut paste that goes into our Reese's peanut butter cups. We tend to think more of the jar of peanut butter on our shelves. Well, that for the most part was not a problem, the peanut butter on shelves. It was these other products that had this contaminated peanut paste. And one of the worst things about this is the company itself, as this unfolded, remained silent. They didn't say, they didn't talk to, for the most part, they didn't talk to the media, they didn't issue statements, and in fact, they went out of business. It was almost as if they turned inward and just wanted to disappear. As the investigation progressed, you saw there were problems with sanitation, inspection, violation of test and hold, things like that. So this is one of, if not the first time, you can see here the gentleman, I believe he's from Oregon, which is where this outbreak first sort of emerged and became an issue. So there were congressional hearings about this. However, one of the worst things about this is certainly the people who died and the people who were affected, but was the criminal violation, right? And so Stuart Parnell, who was the president, CEO of the company, he actually was charged and convicted and has received a 28-year sentence. Interestingly, I believe that he is also in the news fairly recently about trying to get his case appealed and reduce that sentence. So again, we see this many years later, a real issue, this crisis still continuing while the company's gone under and communication from the company perspective is still gone. We're still talking about this. This is still in the news. And so it affects public perception. One of my all-time favorites is the pink slime incident. We have another example here with pink slime where it was not an actual food safety risk, but perceived food safety risk. And this really came out of a major nightly news segment where the journalist really said, this is fraud. This is not actual beef. It shouldn't be in ground beef. The high yuck factor, as we like to say, and the perception that people are eating something with ammonia in it. Yes, all things are made of chemicals. Foods are made of chemicals. But a thing that people associate ammonia with is cleaning your windows or other cleaning products. And so this yuck factor and the ammonia, the chemical component, really created a situation, a big fallout. So the National School Lunch Program no longer was a pledge to no longer use product, ground beef that had this product. Several grocery store chains said, we're not going to sell this anymore. We pledge, we're interested in consumer benefit and taking care of our consumers. So although there were no health risks or problems, or even ethical missteps by BPI, Beef Products Incorporated, the company who manufactured the product, it was still a major issue. And part of that has to do with the fact that the company didn't really see this coming in terms of understanding that this was something that consumers would and could get very upset about. Now, we can have a long, in fact, we should have several sessions to talk about what actually happened and how many warning signs there were prior to this incident that the company should have and could have paid attention to. So the company itself didn't have a strategy. They were aided, to some degree by the National Association of, or excuse me, the NAMI, and I'm not quite sure, National American Meat Institute. Can't quite remember what that stands for anyway, a trade group that works on behalf of the beef industry. And so that organization kind of stepped up and said, here are some, here's some fact sheets, here's some information about this product, that it is not not a terrible thing. It is truly beef, those types of things. But ultimately BPI went out of business. So it's an example of something that's, again, perceived as a risk, as a food safety or foodborne illness issue, but it's not. I was so glad when Professor Poloshka and I talked to each other recently about acknowledging what's going on right now with the bluebell listeria crisis that happened in 2015. One of the interesting things about this crisis, and you see this this infographic here, this is actually something that was put together by the CDC. This crisis was so significant, the CDC took it upon themselves, the communicators, to put together an infographic. So that should sort of tell you how important this was. One of the interesting things to me about bluebell is that it is referred to in a lot of the literature as having a quote unquote cult-like following. Very interesting, and whenever I hear that now, I start worrying about, oop, that organization's going to have a downfall. I feel like it's sort of just a warning sign. But in February 2015 was when there was initial tests related to this outbreak. However, there had been problems for years before. So in April 2015, the company halted halted production and recalled its products. And you can see here multiple states, multiple cases, things like that. Interestingly, Bluebell actually had quite a significant support on their social media as this crisis was happening. There was lots of posting and commenting by the company. And interestingly, there was a lot of support from customers saying that they didn't care that the product was contaminated. They still wanted their Bluebell ice cream. So this support was really extraordinary, especially on their social media. And as we know, the CEO now who was involved in this has been charged, and there was also recently fines and a settlement. So, and that was as of last Friday. So as we say, continuing to be a major issue. I'm going to try and fly through Chipotle because it's one of my favorite, and I tend to slow down and talk about this a little bit more, but Chipotle is what I call the annus horribilis, which is 2015. So a little bit about Chipotle, you probably know it, or at least know of it, even if you're not necessarily a fan. They had an emphasis on food with integrity. And so this was really a part of their brand, and they kind of have a fun, funky vibe. They have very cheeky social media, as you can see an example of their Instagram here. And unfortunately, in 2015, they had 5 separate incidents. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Gosh, yeah, 6, sorry, I should say 5. Different outbreaks with, as you can see, up to 234 in August, another 136 in November, 6 separate incidents of foodborne illness, food safety related crises. Significant. And it all happened from July to December of 2015. So you can see just a quick hit here of, these are articles in the New York Times. Sorry, we have to, lights go off here if you don't move around after a little while, so I have to go wave our hands. So media coverage was, I mean, you know, just as you can imagine, they were pummeled. And so the first slide, or the first image, was from 2015. And since it was the end of 2015, it really spilled over into 2016 through the end of 2016 year. So several things. Pummeled in the press. They actually also have been criticized in the communication literature and the communication study area because they did not change their snarky social media. In fact, they just continued on with the same sort of attitude. And in crisis communication, when you dive in, you really find out that that's a risky move, that is not what the experts would recommend. They would recommend, you know, pausing your regular, right? Because this is a non-routine issue. And so they recommend that you make changes and you acknowledge the crisis and you use social media or whatever the medium is to actually communicate with people and provide information. They didn't do that. We had several apologies, public and prominent. One of the, sorry, I didn't animate this correctly, but the first apology was the CEO, who you can see here, went on the Today Show and issued an apology. If you know anything about American media, the Today Show is sort of it in terms of, you know, getting on a morning show is always sort of a top get for any organization, any company. He issued several apologies, and you saw things like Chipotle eats itself in major magazines like Fast Company, and then another apology, and then fans losing face. So the company, so the company actually ended up significantly down. I think that they are, from what I've heard and read lately, they are seen to be recovering. However, recently there have been stories in several smaller newspapers about reports of employees saying that food safety procedures are not being followed. So there are some indications that this issue is not over. And then we jump to 2018's E. coli and romaine year. And this is notable for several things. I think, to me, what comes to mind first, multiple significant outbreaks in a year. There was one that the reports were issued, I believe, in June. And then again before the Thanksgiving holiday. So the size and the reach, again, of this particular outbreak. And then in November, right before, and you may recall this, right before Thanksgiving, the CDC issued a warning to people to not eat romaine lettuce. And so that was seen as a notable communication difference in this particular incident. So you can see here, this is just one of this is taken straight from the CDC website, but you can see 210 people infected, 36 states, 96 people hospitalized, 5 deaths. So we get to see, again, the impact, right? So this is the map of the the summer incidents and how wide it was. You also see, and I'm sorry you can't see this whole image here, infected by the end of the year outbreak. And so you can see mostly in California and some eastern states, but still an issue, right? This health warning was sort of unprecedented, or really seen as unprecedented. And so the challenges here, really, there are several lessons. And again, I'm not going to read this whole list to you, but I do think some of these are worth pointing out, especially when we come to think about things like the 2003 mad cow bovine spongiform encephalopathy, and when we talk about pink slime. The threat of a crisis is perceptual. So whether or not there is an actual threat, the suffering is included because of the perception of a threat. And then another thing to keep in mind is this idea of good intentions, right? So without good intentions before a crisis, an organization really is at risk of being able to succeed or emerge from a crisis situation. So if you're operating with malintent, quite often that company does either go under or suffers such a loss or such a hit to their reputation that they really aren't able to be successful much in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop for just a few minutes. And I think, what do we have here? We have another break, about 15 minutes. And so it is 10:40. So we will stop back about 10:55. We'll come back and Dr. Poloshka will be with you. When I come and speak with you next, we're going to talk about some specific steps that organizations can take in this crisis management and crisis communication realm to not only lessen the impact and potentially avoid these crises, but to hopefully take care of their stakeholders, take care of customers, and not have these problems happen.